It was the 19th century, an age of empire, steam, gunpowder, and maps still marked with blank white spaces that whispered promises of glory to any man bold or foolish enough to fill them. And among these men stood Sir John Franklin. To many, he was a symbol of courage and conviction. To others, a relic of a fading era, a naval officer who had once survived shipwreck and starvation, but whose best years were long behind him. Yet Franklin didn't think so, not by a long shot. In London, amidst candle-lit salons and smoky gentlemen's clubs, the conversation often drifted to the last great geographical mystery, the Northwest Passage, a supposed sea route over the top of North America that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. Whoever found it would be immortalized not just in history books, but in the very DNA of empire. And Britain wanted it. Not for trade, not really. It wanted it because it was the last jewel unclaimed, the final crown of naval dominance in the Arctic, the prestige of conquering nature itself. But the Arctic was no place for human conquest. The ice didn't care for ambition. The snow couldn't be impressed. The sun might vanish for months at a time, and when it returned, it brought not warmth, but exposure, the terrible clarity of what was left behind. Franklin had already tested himself against the North once, back in 1819, during a grueling land expedition across the Canadian wilderness. He had nearly died. 11 of his men did. They were starving, frostbitten, and by the end, they were eating their own boots, literally. That expedition earned him the grim nickname, the man who ate his boots. But somehow, the world turned it into a badge of honor. That was the strange irony of Franklin's fame. The more he failed and suffered, the more he became a hero. It wasn't about success anymore. It was about surviving where no one else dared to go. But Franklin didn't just want survival. He wanted one last chance at glory, and by the 1840s, as the Royal Navy looked for a figurehead to lead its final push through the Arctic, it turned again to the now gray-haired veteran. He was 59, overweight, and hadn't been to the Arctic in over 2 decades. But in the eyes of the Admiralty, he was respectable, reliable, and perhaps most importantly, he was expendable. Still, Franklin accepted. Maybe he knew it would be his final voyage. Maybe he thought he could cheat the ice one last time. Either way, in May of 1845, he would set sail aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 of the most technologically advanced vessels of their time, fitted with steam engines, reinforced hulls, and enough canned food to last 3 years. The mission? To finally push through the last unexplored sections of the Arctic archipelago and complete the Northwest Passage. He was going to write his name across the top of the world, but what neither he nor his 128 men knew was this: they weren't going to discover a passage. They were going to vanish into legend. Before Franklin ever boarded Erebus or Terror, he endured a trial by snow and starvation that nearly killed him. The year was 1819, and the British Admiralty was obsessed with mapping Canada's Arctic coastline. A younger Franklin, then just 33, was chosen to lead an overland expedition through the vast, frozen wilderness of what is now northern Canada. His orders were simple on paper: travel overland from Hudson Bay to the Coppermine River and chart the unknown northern shore. It was anything but simple in practice. Franklin and his men marched across thousands of miles of untouched terrain with minimal supplies. No proper Arctic experience, and little understanding of the indigenous environment. They relied on native guides and fur traders, but as summer bled into a brutal Arctic winter, support thinned. The party became fragmented, supplies ran dangerously low, and tensions frayed. By the end of the journey, the situation had turned catastrophic. Food was gone. Rations had dwindled to boiled leather. Men began dying of exposure, hypothermia, and slow starvation. Franklin, desperate to survive, ordered his men to boil their own boots, made from animal hide, just to gain a few more calories. Some men snapped. There were whispers of murder, of cannibalism, of madness brought on by hunger and the eternal white silence. 11 men died. Franklin survived. Barely. When he returned to Britain in 1822, his report shocked the Admiralty. But strangely, his suffering became a source of national fascination. The public was enthralled by his resilience. Newspapers dubbed him a hero, a man who had faced nature's wrath and returned. He was now part myth, part man. And most importantly, in the eyes of his superiors, he had proven one thing. He was willing to do whatever it took to complete a mission, no matter the cost. That reputation would follow him into the Arctic, into command, and ultimately into oblivion. John Franklin had barely survived his first Arctic ordeal, but the hunger for exploration and redemption didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. In 1825, just 3 years after returning from the disastrous Coppermine expedition, Franklin set off again. This time, he was better prepared, armed with experience and renewed public admiration. The British Admiralty gave him another mission: chart more of the Arctic coast, this time from the mouth of the Mackenzie River westward, aiming to meet another expedition coming from the Bering Strait. It was a bold plan, one that required perfect timing, cooperation across vast distances, and luck with weather that rarely cooperated. And for a while things went surprisingly well. This second overland journey would be remembered not for its suffering, but for its discipline and determination. Franklin and his men moved swiftly, covering thousands of miles by canoe, raft, and foot. They worked closely with local indigenous communities, particularly the Dene and Inuit peoples, whose knowledge of the land proved critical. Unlike the first expedition, they had more consistent food supplies. There were no tales of boiled leather this time, no whispered fears of mutiny or madness. In fact, when Franklin reached the mouth of the Mackenzie River, he kept going, mapping more coastline than any European before him. By the time he returned to England in 1827, he had charted over 1,200 miles of Arctic shore. It was a stunning accomplishment. The British public, and more importantly, the Admiralty, took notice. Franklin was promoted, honored, married. He even received a knighthood in 1829, becoming Sir John Franklin. The tragedy of his earlier failure had faded into legend. In its place stood a man reborn, a national hero, a scientific mind, and a symbol of what British courage and discipline could achieve against the harshest odds. For a time, Franklin lived in comfort. He was appointed lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania, in 1837, overseeing a distant colony far from the ice and danger. But the Arctic never really left him. Even in the warmth of the southern hemisphere, Franklin carried the cold with him. And as he aged, a realization set in. His greatest legacy still waited for him. Frozen, unfinished. somewhere beyond the northern horizon. By the end of the 1830s, Franklin began quietly preparing for one final expedition. The ice had not defeated him. Not yet. The final voyage began not in ice, but in celebration. On May 19, 1845, 2 ships left Greenhithe, England, to great fanfare. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, both veterans of previous polar missions, had been retrofitted for this journey with reinforced hulls and steam engines. Their crews numbered 129 men, hand-picked from the Royal Navy's best. At their helm, Sir John Franklin, now 59 years old and determined to complete the final link in the Northwest Passage. The ships were marvels of Victorian engineering. Inside, they carried 3 years of provisions: canned meats and vegetables, lemon juice to prevent scurvy, libraries of books, fine china, even a hand organ programmed with popular songs and hymns. It was the British Empire at its most confident, orderly, prepared, and proud. For the men aboard, there was excitement, but also unease. The Arctic was legendary for swallowing expeditions whole, but this one felt different. The best maps, the best technology, the best leader. What could go wrong? After a brief stop in Greenland, where 5 crewmen were discharged due to illness or other reasons, Erebus and Terror were last seen by Europeans at Baffin Bay in late July 1845. Whalers watched them sail westward into Lancaster Sound. Then, nothing. No word, no letters, no sightings. For months, then a year, then 2. In the beginning, no one panicked. It was expected that Arctic voyages might take 2, even 3 years. But by 1847, concern began to grow. Families waited for news. The Admiralty remained silent. The British public grew restless. Lady Franklin, John's wife, refused to sit quietly. She lobbied, pleaded, and eventually shamed the Admiralty into action. A massive rescue effort began, launching dozens of ships and overland searches over the next decade. But the Arctic gave up nothing easily. It kept its secrets under miles of ice and silence. The Erebus and the Terror had vanished, taking their crew with them. What happened next would take over 150 years to piece together. And even now, the ice hasn't told us everything. When Erebus and Terror vanished into Lancaster Sound, they entered more than just frozen waters. They entered a silence that would stretch for centuries. But not everything was lost. Thanks to later discoveries, Inuit oral histories, and scattered artifacts, we now have a partial picture of what happened in that first winter. By September of 1845, the ships had likely reached Beechy Island, a sheltered harbor off the coast of what is now Nunavut, Canada. There they spent the long Arctic winter. The conditions would have been brutal. Outside, the sun vanished for months. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees. Inside the ships, the men clung to routine, keeping journals, reading from the ship's library, holding religious services, playing music on the organ. They tried to pretend it was normal, but nothing was normal. 3 graves remain at Beechy Island. 3 crewmen died during that first winter. Their names are known: John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell. Their bodies, discovered more than a century later, were astonishingly well preserved by the permafrost. Autopsies revealed something chilling. All 3 showed signs of lead poisoning, likely from the tinned food that had been poorly sealed. Their tissues also revealed signs of pneumonia and tuberculosis. They had been slowly, silently poisoned. Still, the expedition carried on. In spring of 1846, Erebus and Terror continued south into Peel Sound. This was the farthest anyone had ever gotten. They were truly in uncharted waters. But then the ice closed in. In September 1846, both ships became trapped off King William Island. And there the second winter began. There would be no rescue, no way forward, no way back. Just endless cold, dwindling food, and the creeping realization that something was going terribly wrong. This was no longer a voyage of discovery. It was the beginning of a slow, frozen descent into survival. And worse, the Arctic does not kill quickly. It waits, watches, starves you, poisons you, freezes you slowly, until all that remains is silence. By early 1847, the men aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had survived 2 brutal winters. They had eaten preserved meat. They had burned through coal reserves. They had endured months without sunlight, and then they lost their leader. Sir John Franklin died on June 11th, 1847. The circumstances remain unclear. He was 61, already in frail health when the voyage began. But the cold, malnutrition, and possible lead poisoning likely sealed his fate. He died in command, still believing in the mission. With Franklin gone, leadership passed to Francis Crozier, captain of the Terror, and James Fitzjames, a charismatic and energetic officer from the Erebus. Together, they faced a terrible decision: stay with the icebound ships, or try to escape across the frozen landscape. And so, the unthinkable began to take shape. That spring, a party left the ships and deposited a note in a metal cylinder on King William Island. It was discovered over a decade later and remains the last written message from the expedition. It read, "H.M. ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April, 1848. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th June, 1847. And the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men." But that was not the most chilling part. In the margins of the paper, someone, likely Crozier, had scrawled an update in frantic handwriting. The ships were abandoned, and 105 survivors were setting out on foot to walk hundreds of miles toward safety, across solid ice, dragging sledges, starving, possibly already dying. That moment marked the true turning point. The expedition was no longer a quest for discovery. It had become a desperate retreat from death. And yet, death would follow. In the months to come, the survivors would leave behind trails of sorrow, abandoned boats, scattered bones, and the final whispers of a journey that had begun with pride and would end in legend. They set out dragging sledges, 105 men, weak from starvation, sick with lead poisoning, wearing naval uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. They left the safety, if it could still be called that, of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and began the long march south toward the Back River. It was a desperate plan. The route was hundreds of miles long through uncharted frozen wilderness. They had no dogs, no fresh meat, just whatever rations they could carry and the fading hope of reaching a Hudson's Bay Company outpost. Leading them was Captain Francis Crozier. A seasoned Arctic veteran, Crozier had long feared this exact scenario. He knew the odds were terrible, but doing nothing meant certain death. He chose to gamble on movement. The men pulled heavy wooden sledges loaded with supplies, boats, and whatever personal belongings they could carry. One sledge, found years later, contained silver cutlery, books, even silk handkerchiefs, an eerie reminder of how little they understood the journey ahead. They were already dying. One by one, men fell and were buried in shallow graves, or not at all. Bones discovered in the 1980s and 1990s showed cut marks, evidence of cannibalism. The Arctic, which had once been a frontier of ambition, had turned into a pitiless graveyard. Yet still they walked. Inuit oral histories speak of men dragging boats across the ice, of white men starving, of small groups begging for food. One story tells of a lone figure found near the river's edge, face down, his hands clawed into the gravel as though trying to crawl a few feet farther. None of them made it. Not a single man from that 1848 escape attempt is known to have survived. Crozier's final fate remains unknown. Some legends claim he lived for a time among the Inuit. Others believe he was the last to die, possibly near the mouth of the Back River. What is certain is this: the last act of the Franklin expedition was not a noble march. It was a slow-motion collapse, a staggering procession of the dead, a final frozen silence stretching across the ice. When the British Admiralty finally launched search missions, they expected to find survivors. What they found instead were whispers, clues, bones, and stories. Inuit communities across the Canadian Arctic had witnessed something the British had not: the slow death of Franklin's men. The Inuit oral tradition is strong, memories passed down with remarkable accuracy over generations. For decades, these accounts were ignored or dismissed by European investigators. Only later would they be recognized as critical pieces of the puzzle. Inuit hunters spoke of meeting starving white men wandering the tundra, dragging sledges, begging for food. They described abandoned camps, broken boats, and even one ship, intact, empty, and eerily silent, trapped in the ice. Some told of a group that resorted to cannibalism to survive. Others spoke of seeing corpses scattered across the snow, some with limbs cut or burned. One of the most detailed accounts came from an Inuit elder named Inukpujijuk, interviewed in the 19th century. He described a ship crushed by the ice and another that drifted south, eventually sinking. His testimony, long dismissed, would later align with modern discoveries. Over the next decade, search parties led by explorers like John Ray, Francis Leopold McClintock, and Charles Francis Hall collected these oral histories and pieced together a grim mosaic. They found skeletons laid out on the ground or inside makeshift tents, a lifeboat on a sledge containing 2 dead men and supplies that made little sense for travel, journals, buttons, medals, and engraved silverware, objects that told of status but not survival, and always the silence of the ice. For years, the British public struggled to accept the Inuit reports, especially those about cannibalism. Victorian ideals of heroism left no room for such horrors. But the truth was there. The Arctic had not kept it secret entirely. It had whispered it to those who lived closest to it. And if anyone had listened sooner, the story of the Franklin expedition might have been different. But no one did, until it was far too late. In the decades after the Franklin expedition vanished, search parties and Arctic explorers stumbled upon haunting traces of the men who had once sailed with such hope. They found bones scattered along the route from King William Island toward the Back River. They lay exposed to the wind and snow. Some were buried, others abandoned where men had collapsed. What they told us, more than a century later, was horrifying. In the 1980s, Canadian forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Beatty launched a project to examine human remains from the expedition using modern science. His team exhumed the bodies of the 3 men buried on Beechey Island, Torrington, Brain, and Hartnell. What they found stunned the world. The corpses were almost perfectly preserved, skin, hair, fingernails, all intact under layers of permafrost. But inside, the story was grim. Tissue samples revealed dangerously high levels of lead, likely from poorly soldered food tins or from the ship's water system. The men were being slowly poisoned. Worse still, many remains found farther south showed cut marks, clear evidence of defleshing. Some bones had been broken open to extract marrow, the last nutrient-rich option when all else was gone. It was confirmation of what Inuit witnesses had said for over a century. Cannibalism had occurred. The press in Britain reacted with outrage and denial. The idea that the finest men of the Royal Navy had resorted to such primal acts was an assault on Victorian ideals of honor and heroism. But the bones didn't lie. They told of frostbite and starvation, of desperate choices, of a slow unraveling of civilization in the face of nature's indifference. Some skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. Others had marks suggesting repeated attempts to remove flesh. The men had died in stages, some quickly, some slowly, and the last survivors had been left with unthinkable decisions. And yet, even in their suffering, they carried with them silverware, books, and medals, symbols of empire, as if they believed that civilization, by sheer will, could survive the Arctic. But the snow kept falling, and the bones kept whispering the truth. Long after the last of Franklin's men had perished, 2 questions remained. Where were the ships? What happened to HMS Erebus and HMS Terror? For over a century and a half, explorers, scientists, and adventurers searched the Canadian Arctic for answers. Dozens of expeditions scoured coastlines, interviewed Inuit elders, and studied old naval charts. The sea ice held its secrets tightly. Every few years brought false leads, rumors, and disappointment. Inuit oral histories provided clues all along. Elders told of a ship trapped in the ice that later drifted south. Another had sunk after being crushed. Some claimed to have entered one of the ships, still filled with supplies and eerily intact. These accounts were detailed, but many Western historians refused to trust them. That was a mistake. In 2008, Parks Canada launched a renewed effort, this time with the latest technology, sonar mapping, autonomous underwater vehicles, and a new attitude, one that finally took Inuit knowledge seriously. Then, in 2014, the breakthrough came. A sonar image revealed the wreck of HMS Erebus, sitting upright in relatively shallow water near King William Island, almost exactly where Inuit accounts had placed it. The discovery stunned the world. After 169 years, the ship had been found. 2 years later, in 2016, came the second miracle. HMS Terror was found in Terror Bay, some 72 miles south, in even better condition, almost as if it had been gently placed on the seafloor. Windows were intact. Doors were closed. The wreck looked undisturbed. The discovery of both ships transformed the investigation. Divers began retrieving artifacts, plates still stacked, boots under bunks, journals fused together by salt and time. Questions emerged. Why did the ships split up? Were men still living aboard them in their final days? Could there be written records locked in sealed drawers? Perhaps, someday, we will know. For now, the Erebus and Terror rest beneath the water, frozen tombs in a changing Arctic, not lost, just waiting. When divers first entered the wreck of HMS Erebus, they weren't just exploring a shipwreck. They were stepping into a perfectly preserved Victorian time capsule. Inside, time had stopped. Plates remained stacked neatly in cupboards. Boots were still tucked under bunks. Drawers were sealed shut. Oil lamps, instruments, tools, everything was exactly where it had been left nearly 2 centuries before. But what the divers sought most was information. Letters, logs, orders, anything written that could reveal what truly happened after the ships were trapped. Paper doesn't usually survive underwater, but in the frigid, oxygen-poor Arctic waters, there was hope. Over multiple seasons, Parks Canada teams carefully mapped the interiors using remote-operated vehicles and divers in specially controlled dives. Each room was treated like a crime scene, nothing touched unless fully documented. On HMS Terror, the discovery was even more surreal. The ship was found in pristine condition. Doors were shut. A table still had a teacup resting on it. Some beds appeared made. It was as though the crew had stepped out and never returned. Divers found the captain's cabin still sealed, possibly containing Franklin's or Crozier's final orders, journals, or maps. The chance of recovering legible documents remains uncertain, but every drawer, every locker is a potential revelation. But the wrecks didn't just hold secrets of the voyage. They revealed how the men lived and died, the layout of supplies, the medicine kits, the personal effects. Each object told a story of survival, struggle, and the stubborn grip on routine and discipline even in the face of doom. And one other mystery remained. Why were the ships in different locations? Why had the Terror drifted so far from the Erebus? Did some of the men return to the ships after abandoning them? There is evidence that suggests exactly that. The Arctic may still be silent, but it is no longer mute. Bit by bit, the ships are speaking, and their story is far from over. Why did the Franklin expedition fail so catastrophically? Even with the ships found and the bones exhumed, many questions remain. Historians, scientists, and explorers have debated the cause of the disaster for over 170 years, and while no single explanation fully accounts for everything, several theories stand out. The first is lead poisoning. As early as the 1980s, researchers discovered abnormally high lead levels in the bodies of Franklin's crew. The solder used to seal the thousands of tin food cans may have leached into the contents. Additionally, the ship's water systems, made of lead piping, may have contributed further. The effects of lead poisoning are devastating. Confusion, weakness, impaired judgment, hallucinations. For men navigating a frozen wasteland, it would have been a death sentence. The second theory is botulism or food contamination. The rush to produce tens of thousands of canned rations meant corners were likely cut. Some cans were improperly sealed or contaminated. Symptoms of botulism include paralysis and death. If even a portion of the food supply was tainted, it could have triggered the expedition's decline. Then there's the issue of scurvy and malnutrition. Despite lemon juice and preserved vegetables, scurvy may have taken hold after the first year. Vitamin C breaks down over time, especially in tinned form. Swollen gums, bleeding, weakness, symptoms that would turn Arctic survival into agony. Next, environmental extremes. The Arctic in the 1840s experienced particularly harsh ice conditions. The Franklin ships became trapped in one of the worst choke points of the Northwest Passage. With no way forward and no way back, they were forced into a multi-year standstill. And then there's the human element. Franklin was a man of principle, but not necessarily the most adaptable leader. His strict adherence to naval discipline may have slowed crucial decisions. When he died, Crozier, a more flexible commander, had little time to adjust the mission. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. The isolation, darkness, and slow decay of hope likely drove many to despair. Add to that the weight of imperial arrogance, the belief that British engineering, order, and class hierarchy could tame the most hostile environment on Earth, and the expedition's doom seems almost inevitable. Lead, ice, hunger, pride. Together, they created a perfect storm of collapse, and all that remained were the traces and the silence. When John Franklin vanished into the Arctic, the British Admiralty hesitated, but his wife did not. Jane Franklin was more than just a grieving widow. She was a force of nature, a well-connected, intelligent, and fiercely determined woman who refused to let her husband's name be buried beneath the ice. When the Admiralty delayed sending rescue missions in the late 1840s, Jane lobbied Parliament, wrote letters to powerful friends, and rallied the British public. She refused to accept silence as an answer. Through newspapers, pamphlets, and public appearances, she made the fate of the Franklin expedition a matter of national urgency, and the public responded. Spurred by her efforts, dozens of expeditions were launched by sea and land across Canada's Arctic, turning the Franklin mystery into a global obsession. She even used her own funds to finance private rescue missions. Jane Franklin's campaign was relentless. She corresponded with explorers, geographers, and even Arctic indigenous communities. Her passion kept the search alive for decades long after the Admiralty had given up, but her motives were complex. It wasn't just about finding Franklin. It was about preserving his legacy. Victorian Britain idolized its heroes, and Jane was determined that her husband would be remembered not as a failed commander, but as a martyr to exploration. When grisly rumors of cannibalism reached England, Jane worked tirelessly to suppress them. She dismissed Inuit testimonies. She publicly criticized searchers who gave them credence. The thought of Franklin's men, British officers, resorting to such acts was unthinkable to her. And yet, without Jane Franklin, it's likely that no search would have lasted as long, no answers would have been uncovered, and the final fate of the expedition might have remained lost forever. She died in 1875, having never learned the full truth. But her devotion reshaped the history of Arctic exploration, because she didn't just mourn her husband, she turned grief into a mission and ensured that John Franklin's name would echo across the ice for generations to come. The Franklin expedition didn't just vanish into the ice, it ignited a fire across the world. From the late 1840s through the end of the 19th century, the fate of Erebus and Terror became one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age. Newspapers across Europe and North America published endless columns of speculation. Lectures were held in theaters, novels were inspired, poems were written, public donations poured in to support further expeditions. The Arctic wasn't just a place of exploration anymore, it became a stage of national drama, and Franklin, its tragic hero. Dozens of expeditions followed in his icy footsteps. Britain launched naval missions. The United States sent their own ships. Even France and Russia expressed interest. Arctic exploration became a geopolitical symbol, each journey northward not only a scientific endeavor, but a declaration of imperial prestige. Search parties were both fascinated and haunted by what they found. Abandoned sledges, sun-bleached bones, strange artifacts far from any safe route. Each clue deepened the mystery, and each year Lady Franklin's voice amplified the cause. But something else was happening too. The world's obsession with Franklin helped spark a cultural fascination with the Arctic itself. It became a land of myth and menace, frozen beauty laced with death. Writers like Charles Dickens romanticized the men who had died with their duty done. Artists painted scenes of gallant crews and ghost ships under glowing auroras. The ice had swallowed them, yes, but it had elevated them to legend. And yet, beneath the sentiment, there was unease. Whispers of cannibalism, bones with cut marks, Inuit stories that didn't match British fantasies. The truth was darker than the public was willing to accept. So, Victorian society split the narrative, heroic sacrifice on the surface and grim silence beneath. The Franklin expedition became a mirror for the 19th century's greatest contradiction, the pride of empire and the fear of what lay beyond its limits. Even today, the obsession remains. Books, documentaries, TV dramas, podcasts. Franklin's name still echoes, still drifts through the snow like a question unanswered. What happened out there? And why couldn't we look away? Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Franklin expedition vanished, and yet its legacy remains profoundly alive. The Erebus and Terror weren't just ships. They became symbols of ambition, of failure, of the terrible cost of pushing beyond the known world. But with time, the narrative has changed. For years, the story was one of heroic British sacrifice, gallant officers fighting nature to the bitter end. That version, shaped by empire and mourning, erased key truths, the mistakes made, the arrogance shown, and the wisdom ignored. Today, we know better. We've learned to listen not just to bones and wrecks, but to the Inuit voices who carried the real story for generations. Their testimonies, once cast aside, proved essential to locating the ships and understanding the expedition's final days. We've learned that technology alone isn't enough. Erebus and Terror were marvels of engineering, yet they were defeated by ice, hunger, and time. What doomed them wasn't just nature, but human decisions made far from the Arctic. We've learned how fragile life becomes in extreme environments. The lead, the canned food, the social hierarchy that kept officers warm while sailors froze. These things matter when survival is on the line. But we've also learned about resilience. The Franklin men didn't surrender easily. They marched. They endured. They tried to adapt even as their world collapsed. And in doing so, they left behind a mystery that would inspire centuries of search and discovery. The wrecks have become underwater laboratories, offering insight not just into the past, but into how we explore the planet today. Arctic archaeologists are still documenting what remains. New technology may yet uncover the written words of men long dead. And as the Arctic itself melts, warming faster than any other place on Earth, this frozen story gains new relevance. The ice that once sealed their fate is retreating, and with it, more secrets may come to light. The Franklin expedition failed in its goal, but it succeeded in giving us a haunting, invaluable reminder that the world does not yield easily, that hubris is dangerous, and that some stories survive not because of triumph, but because of what they cost. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Franklin expedition vanished, and yet its legacy remains profoundly alive. The Erebus and Terror weren't just ships. They became symbols of ambition, of failure, of the terrible cost of pushing beyond the known world. But with time, the narrative has changed. For years, the story was one of heroic British sacrifice, gallant officers fighting nature to the bitter end. That version, shaped by empire and mourning, erased key truths, the mistakes made, the arrogance shown, and the wisdom ignored. Today, we know better. We've learned to listen not just to bones and wrecks, but to the Inuit voices who carried the real story for generations. Their testimonies, once cast aside, proved essential to locating the ships and understanding the expedition's final days. We've learned that technology alone isn't enough. Erebus and Terror were marvels of engineering, yet they were defeated by ice, hunger, and time. What doomed them wasn't just nature, but human decisions made far from the Arctic. We've learned how fragile life becomes in extreme environments. The lead, the canned food, the social hierarchy that kept officers warm while sailors froze. These things matter when survival is on the line. But we've also learned about resilience. The Franklin men didn't surrender easily. They marched. They endured. They tried to adapt even as their world collapsed. And in doing so, they left behind a mystery that would inspire centuries of search and discovery. The wrecks have become underwater laboratories, offering insight not just into the past, but into how we explore the planet today. Arctic archaeologists are still documenting what remains. New technology may yet uncover the written words of men long dead. And as the Arctic itself melts, warming faster than any other place on Earth, this frozen story gains new relevance. The ice that once sealed their fate is retreating, and with it, more secrets may come to light. The Franklin expedition failed in its goal, but it succeeded in giving us a haunting, invaluable reminder that the world does not yield easily, that hubris is dangerous, and that some stories survive not because of triumph, but because of what they cost. For over a century, the story of the Franklin expedition was cloaked in heroic myth. Franklin and his men were praised as martyrs of empire, brave souls who ventured into the unknown and died in pursuit of progress. School books, portraits, and memorials immortalize them as symbols of Victorian courage. But myths are rarely the full truth. The deeper we dig, literally and historically, the more complicated the story becomes. Heroism did exist. So did suffering, but also arrogance, misjudgment, and a refusal to listen. So what happens when we rewrite the narrative? We begin to see Franklin not just as a noble leader, but as a man shaped by the prejudices and blind spots of his time. He underestimated the Arctic. He dismissed Inuit knowledge. He relied on outdated strategies in a terrain that punished ignorance. We see his officers not as flawless heroes, but as humans, proud, frightened, exhausted, and slowly unraveling. We see the sailors as the backbone of the mission, many of them poor and illiterate, who paid with their lives for decisions made far above their heads. We recognize that empire and ego played a role, that the rush to claim the Northwest Passage ignored the voices of those who had already mastered it, the indigenous peoples. And we realized that the myth was not created by the men themselves, but by those who stayed behind, by Victorian Britain, which needed a tale of sacrifice, by Lady Franklin, who campaigned for her husband's glory, by a society unwilling to admit that even its greatest institutions could fail. Yet in breaking down the myth, something powerful happens. The story doesn't shrink, it deepens. Now Franklin's expedition becomes a story not just of tragedy, but of human complexity. It's about survival and blindness, innovation and rigidity, bravery and fear. It's about what happens when belief meets reality and loses. And in that, there is room for empathy. The Arctic didn't ask for heroes, it demanded respect. And in rewriting the story, we don't dishonor the men who died. We finally begin to understand them. In 1845, HMS Erebus and Terror were considered marvels of naval engineering. They were retrofitted with the best equipment available: steam engines, reinforced hulls, advanced heating systems, and over 3 years of provisions. They had tinned food, an innovation meant to revolutionize naval rations. Their hulls were lined with iron and oak, designed to withstand pressure from sea ice. In theory, they were unstoppable. In practice, they were doomed. The Franklin expedition is a case study in how technology alone can't save you, especially when it's used in the wrong context or misunderstood. Take the steam engines. Designed for riverboats, they were powerful but not built for Arctic ice. They added weight and required coal, which took up valuable space. The ships had sails too, but in frozen channels, neither propulsion method worked well. The canned food, mass-produced by a single London contractor, was rushed to meet deadlines. Some cans were sealed poorly or contaminated. They provided calories, but possibly also botulism, lead, and disaster. Then there were the heating systems. Innovative hot water pipes ran through the ship to warm the decks, but they often failed. Heat didn't reach all parts of the ship, and cold crept in regardless. The technology was untested in such extreme conditions. Even the clothing was a mismatch. The Royal Navy issued thick woolen uniforms and leather boots, not suited for Arctic travel. Men froze in gear meant for wet ships, not sled journeys across snow-covered plains. Inuit-style furs, footwear, and modular layers were available, but deemed primitive by British officers. The most dangerous flaw wasn't in the tools, it was in the mindset. The British believed technology could conquer nature, that ships, steel, and schedules could tame a landscape carved by wind, snow, and time. They underestimated how quickly innovation becomes irrelevant when it's built without context. The Arctic didn't care how advanced their gear was, it only cared whether it worked. And when it didn't, the ice came in. The pressure crushed iron hulls. The cold seeped through lined walls. The silence swallowed every signal. In the end, Erebus and Terror were not beaten by poor planning alone. They were defeated by a belief that progress could ignore place. And in the Arctic, that belief is fatal. Some stories never thaw. Long after the men of Erebus and Terror perished, their tale lived on, not just in history books, but in popular imagination. The Franklin expedition became a haunting symbol, echoing through art, literature, television, and film. Why? Because it contains everything a myth needs: mystery, heroism, tragedy, and the vast silence of the unknown. In the 19th century, Franklin's story inspired countless poems, paintings and newspaper serials. Artists like Thomas Smith and William Westall captured imagined scenes of gallant officers facing death with stoic grace. These images, though romanticized, shaped public perception for decades. In literature, the Franklin expedition haunted the pages of Victorian novels. Charles Dickens himself weighed in, fiercely defending the honor of the crew and denying any whispers of cannibalism, despite growing evidence. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the story found new life. Writers like Margaret Atwood, Dan Simmons, and Andrea Barrett explored the psychological toll and cultural implications of Arctic exploration. Simmons's 2007 novel, The Terror, a historical horror fiction, imagined supernatural forces stalking the crew through the snow. It was adapted into a critically acclaimed AMC series in 2018, blending historical accuracy with chilling myth. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels have also taken up the tale. Each year, new content introduces younger generations to the mystery and to the slowly emerging answers. Why does this story persist? Because it taps into something timeless, the human need to explore, and the fear of what that exploration costs. The Arctic becomes a mirror, reflecting not just the dangers of nature, but our own hubris, bravery, and desperation. Franklin's men may have vanished, but their story was never truly lost. It remains embedded in our culture, in ghost stories, survival films, historical fiction, and speculative thrillers. We return to it again and again, not for answers, but for meaning. And perhaps because part of us sees our own reflection in the ice, the desire to know, and the fear of what we might find. At the heart of the Franklin story lies a dream. The Northwest Passage, a sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic archipelago of northern Canada, was once seen as the ultimate prize, a shortcut for global trade, a key to empire, a final frontier. But the truth is more complicated. For centuries, European explorers chased this route, believing it would transform global commerce. Martin Frobisher, Henry Hudson, James Cook, and William Parry all searched for it. Most failed. Some disappeared. The landscape was unforgiving, the ice unrelenting. Then came Franklin. By the 1840s, most of the passage had been mapped. Only a final link remained. Franklin was sent to close that gap, but he and his men vanished before the task was done. Ironically, it was Franklin's death, not his success, that led to the final mapping of the route, the dozens of rescue missions that followed over the next 20 years. Filled in the blanks he could not. But the question remained, was the Northwest Passage ever truly useful? The answer is, not really. For most of history, it was frozen for 10 to 11 months of the year, treacherous, slow, and deadly. By the time modern icebreakers could make the journey safely, the Suez Canal and Panama Canal had long since replaced the need. So what was the passage, really? Not a trade route, not a gateway to riches. It was a symbol of control, of scientific ambition, of imperial pride. It promised more than it could deliver. It lured men into a place that could not be owned. Today, the Northwest Passage is slowly changing. Climate change is melting Arctic ice at unprecedented rates. Each year, more ships attempt to traverse the passage during summer months. It may one day become viable, but at a terrible cost. The irony is chilling. The dream that claimed Franklin's life may finally come true, not because we conquered the Arctic, but because we've broken it. And in that fragile waterway lies a reminder. The Arctic never promised passage. We just kept looking for one anyway. Few archaeological sites are as remote, cold, and logistically complex as the wrecks of HMS Erebus and Terror. But that hasn't stopped scientists. Since their discovery, Erebus in 2014 and Terror in 2016, Parks Canada has spearheaded one of the most ambitious underwater archaeology projects in history. The goal? To preserve, document, and eventually understand exactly what happened in the expedition's final days. The work is painstaking. Dive seasons are limited to a few short weeks each year when the sea ice retreats just enough for access. The water is near freezing. Visibility is low. Every movement is slow and deliberate. Using remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, divers have mapped the interiors, recovered artifacts, and peered into long, sealed cabins. High-resolution sonar and 3D imaging recreate the ships digitally, allowing researchers to examine every plank, nail, and hatch without disturbing them. But this is more than exploration. It's conservation. The wrecks are fragile. Microbes, rust, and even climate change threaten their preservation. Each artifact must be documented, stabilized, and stored under controlled conditions. Even a single spoon, improperly handled, could disintegrate. What have they found? Officer uniforms and boots in perfect condition. Dishes stacked neatly in drawers. Medicine bottles, journals, tools, and cooking equipment. A sealed captain's desk in the Terror, its contents still unknown. And most hauntingly, human remains. Bones and fragments, some hidden within the wrecks themselves. Each one treated with the utmost respect and care. These are not just relics. They are the last traces of men who died far from home. This archaeology is not about treasure, it's about truth. It's about honoring the past by learning from it, about listening to what the wood and metal can tell us where words no longer exist. And as climate change reshapes the Arctic, time is running out. The ice once sealed the Erebus and Terror in silence. Now it's melting, and for the first time in over 170 years, the Franklin expedition is speaking, softly, through sediment and shadow and science. For over 150 years, historians, sailors, and scientists scoured the Arctic, looking for answers to the Franklin mystery. But the truth had always been there. The Inuit people, whose ancestors lived and traveled across the very same terrain where Franklin's men died, carried the story all along, in memory, in song, and in testimony. They had seen the men, they had seen the ships, they had witnessed the end. Elders described ships trapped in the ice, white men marching across the land, dragging boats, starving, desperate. They told of men who had died in small groups, of bodies left beside rivers, and of ships that drifted eerily with no crew visible. These stories were passed down orally from one generation to the next. They were detailed, consistent, and clear, and yet, for more than a century, they were dismissed. British and American explorers often viewed these accounts as superstition or exaggeration. Victorian-era racism painted indigenous testimony as unreliable, even though those same stories would later be verified by archaeological discoveries. One Inuit man, Inukpujijuk, gave one of the most important early testimonies. His words were recorded by searchers at the 1850s. He described ships, death, and even what appeared to be cannibalism. Today, modern science backs up nearly everything he said. In fact, The discovery of HMS Erebus in 2014 happened exactly where Inuit stories said it would be, near King William Island, in an area once ignored by European maps. The Franklin story has since become a turning point in archaeology, a moment when oral tradition was validated by physical evidence, and when the voices once cast aside were finally brought to the forefront. Now modern search teams partner closely with Inuit communities, expeditions are co-led, discoveries are shared, and the Inuit role in Arctic history is no longer footnote. It is centerpiece. Because in the end, they were not just observers, they were witnesses. And for those who would listen, they always had the truth. It was never lost, just unheard. The Franklin expedition didn't just leave behind wrecks and rumors. It left behind warnings. Warnings about leadership, planning, cultural blindness, and the limits of technology. Warnings written not on paper, but in frost-bitten footsteps and sun-bleached bones. And though they were slow to be understood, those lessons are now more relevant than ever. First, nature doesn't negotiate. Franklin's expedition believed discipline, hardware, and hierarchy could outmatch the Arctic. But the ice doesn't care about medals or ranks. The cold does not yield to confidence. Today's explorers and climate scientists know this deeply. They've learned to respect, not challenge, the extremes. Second, arrogance is fatal. The refusal to listen to Inuit knowledge, to adapt, to consider alternatives, this pride costs lives. Modern science now embraces cross-cultural insight. From polar research to disaster response, humility has become as valuable as data. Third, human systems crack under pressure. The expedition started with optimism, structure, and faith in empire. But starvation, illness, and psychological stress dismantled that quickly. Now, survival training, from astronauts to submariners, studies the Franklin ordeal to understand what isolation does to teams and minds. Fourth, myths distort truth. For decades, Britain refused to accept what had happened: cannibalism, mistakes, collapse. Instead, it wrapped the story in patriotism. Today, historians see this as a cautionary tale about how national pride can warp history and how truth must be allowed to surface, even when it's uncomfortable. Finally, failure can teach more than success. The Franklin expedition didn't find the Northwest Passage, but it reshaped our understanding of the Arctic. It pushed boundaries. It gave rise to new technologies, methods, and cross-cultural collaborations. And perhaps most importantly, it made us listen to indigenous wisdom, to scientific evidence, to stories told in silence and snow. Today, as we face a rapidly changing world, from polar melt to global conflict, the lessons of Erebus and Terror still whisper across the ice. Prepare better, listen harder, respect the land, because exploration without understanding is just another name for getting lost. Exploration sounds noble until you see the graves. 3 white wooden crosses stand on Beechy Island, marking the final resting place of John Torrington, William Braine, and John Hartnell, the first to die during Franklin's final voyage. Their frozen faces, preserved by permafrost, have become iconic, not because they conquered anything, but because they didn't. They are the beginning of a list that ends in snow. In total, 129 men sailed into the Arctic in 1845. None came back. That number is often repeated in history books, but it risks becoming a statistic, something easy to forget. In truth, it represents 129 lives, sons, fathers, husbands, Sailors who wrote letters, joked with shipmates, and believed they were a part of something great. Instead, they became the price, the cost of ambition, of imperial pride, of underestimating the Arctic. Their bodies were left behind, some buried in shallow graves, others scattered along the frozen trail south from King William Island. A lifeboat with 2 corpses, skeletons with signs of starvation, bones marked by knives, and for each man a story cut short. We often talk about what was lost, the ships, the records, the mission, but the real loss was human. These were not mythical explorers, they were people. Many were poor, some were pressed into service, some likely didn't understand the risks until it was too late. And yet, even as their situation worsened, they held on. Some marched. Some maintained discipline. Some wrote final messages in the margins of official documents. They tried to endure. Today, their names are carved into memorials. Their stories are retold in books and documentaries. But the true memorial is the Arctic itself. It holds them still, their graves, their scattered bones, their last traces frozen in time. And with them, a truth explorers often forget. That discovery always has a cost, and sometimes it's everything. The ice holds many secrets, but none as persistent as Franklin's ghost. Not the man exactly, but what he represents, a shadow lingering over every tale of exploration, a question posed in every howl of Arctic wind. What compels us to walk into the unknown? The Franklin expedition has become more than a historical mystery. It's a mythical touchstone, a canvas onto which generations have projected fear, admiration, regret, and warning. It haunts because it was so close to greatness. Franklin wasn't a reckless adventurer. He was careful, experienced, and well-equipped, at least by the standards of his time. And yet he and his men were consumed, not in one violent moment, but in a slow, creeping unraveling, day by frozen day. That's what makes it haunting. The story unfolds not with glory, but with silence, with boots dragging across ice, with ships groaning under pressure, with minds fraying in the dark. There is no final message, no conclusive record, just fragments. A note in a cairn, bones on the tundra, a shipwreck beneath the waves. And so the mind fills the void with terror, with awe, with questions. What did they think as the food ran out? What did Crozier see as he led his men south? Who was the last to die? We don't know, and maybe we never will. That's why the story endures. Franklin's ghost follows us into every uncertain place, every dark wilderness, every moment when planning fails and instinct takes over. It reminds us that progress has a cost, that knowledge doesn't come freely, that even the best prepared can fall when they forget one truth. Nature is not ours to master. In the frozen silence of the Arctic, Franklin still lingers, not just in the wrecks or the graves, but in the haunting feeling that some journeys are never truly finished, only paused, waiting to be understood, waiting to be heard. In Franklin's time, the Arctic was an iron prison, endless ice, black winters, a place so cold and unyielding that it swallowed ships whole and silenced 129 men forever. But that Arctic is changing. Today, temperatures in the polar regions are rising at twice the global average. Sea ice is retreating. Permafrost is thawing. Landscapes that were once locked in ice year-round now see open water in summer. It sounds like opportunity. Shipping companies eye the Northwest Passage with new interest. Countries compete for Arctic dominance. Oil, gas, and mineral rights lie exposed beneath thinning ice. For the first time, what was once a frozen tomb seems to offer wealth, power, and access. But the ghosts haven't left. The Franklin expedition teaches us what happens when ambition outpaces understanding. And now, as nations return to the Arctic with satellites and submarines, they're doing so under a sky changed by human hands. The risks are different, but no less real. Fragile ecosystems, collapsing coastlines, rising seas, cultural disruption. The Inuit, whose voices were ignored in Franklin's time, now face modern displacements from a land melting beneath their feet. And there's irony, too. Franklin's ships were trapped because the ice was too strong. Now, those same waters are opening, not from triumph, but from crisis. The Arctic doesn't need to trap ships to be dangerous. It just needs to change fast enough that we can't keep up. And the lessons of Erebus and Terror are still waiting. Don't mistake confidence for preparedness. Don't dismiss the knowledge of those who live where you explore. Don't assume nature will stay where it's always been. The melting Arctic isn't a frontier, it's a warning. A place where the past echoes loudly, and where, if we're not careful, the future may freeze over just the same. The Franklin expedition did not sail alone. It sailed under a flag. The Union Jack flew proudly from Erebus and Terror, not just as a marker of national identity, but as a banner of empire. Wherever British ships landed, so too arrived the notion of sovereignty, control, and civilization. The Arctic was not simply a place to explore, it was a place to claim, and that's a part of the Franklin story that's often overlooked. This wasn't just about finding the Northwest Passage. It was about expanding the reach of empire into the last blank spaces on the map. The Franklin expedition, like many before it, was funded, equipped, and celebrated not solely for science, but for what it could bring back in power and prestige. But exploration has consequences. The British, for all their planning, did not discover the Arctic. The Inuit had lived there for centuries. They had names for the rivers, the winds, the stars. They had maps in their minds, stories in their tongues, survival in their bones. And yet, when British explorers arrived, they renamed everything. They planted flags, drew borders, claimed dominion over ice and tundra. The Arctic was treated as empty, simply because it did not look like England. The irony is deep. Franklin's men perished in a land they tried to map, while ignoring those who already knew it. Today, as indigenous voices reclaim their stories, there's a growing recognition that the narrative of Arctic exploration was not just one of courage, it was also one of erasure. Inuit knowledge was dismissed, Inuit agency was overwritten, and the story became one of empire, not community. But that's changing. Modern expeditions now partner with Inuit organizations. Places once renamed are being returned to their original identities. Science and heritage are increasingly shared, because beneath the flag was always something else. A world already full, already known, already home. And if Franklin's fate teaches us anything, it's that no claim survives without respect, not even the one carved in ice. Franklin and his men vanished into ice, but they were not forgotten. In the years and decades that followed, dozens of men and women chased their ghostly trail. The search for Franklin became its own epic, one filled with its own tragedies, discoveries, and legends. The first searchers came from duty. By 1847, when no word had returned from Erebus and Terror, the British Admiralty finally took action. Nudged forcefully by Lady Jane Franklin, whose tireless campaigning made the expedition's fate a national concern, naval missions were dispatched. Overland expeditions marched across Canada's barren tundra. Whaling ships were hired to comb the Arctic coast. Then came the searches of conviction. Men like John Ray, a Scottish doctor and Hudson's Bay Company explorer, who in 1854 uncovered the first real clues to Franklin's fate. Ray listened to Inuit witnesses, believed them, and brought back devastating news. The crew was dead, and there were signs of cannibalism. For this truth, Ray was vilified. Charles Dickens attacked him in print. The public recoiled. Empire couldn't bear the image of its sons reduced to such horror. But Ray was right. Then came Francis Leopold McClintock, who in 1859 retrieved the only written note ever found from the expedition, buried in a cairn on King William Island. That single sheet confirmed Franklin's death and the abandonment of the ships. Others followed: Charles Francis Hall, Frederick Schwatka, Frederick Inglefield, names now nearly as etched in Arctic history as Franklin himself. Some mapped coastlines, some recovered relics. Many nearly died themselves. But they were more than explorers. They were historians with sledges, archaeologists before the word existed, pilgrims driven by grief, mystery, and duty. Their work slowly revealed the path of retreat, the scattered graves, the harsh final miles. Without them, Franklin would have remained just another ship lost at sea. Instead, he became legend, because the silence left by Erebus and Terror was filled not by answers, but by searchers. Those who refused to look away, and whose footsteps, frozen into snow, became part of the story too. When Franklin sailed north in 1845, the Arctic was a fortress of ice. Now it's vanishing. Summer sea ice, once thick and impassable, is melting at a staggering rate. Entire regions that were once unreachable are now navigable by ship. Wildlife patterns are changing, permafrost is collapsing, glaciers are retreating into memory, and the question is no longer whether the Arctic will transform. It's how fast. This transformation isn't just environmental. It's geopolitical. Nations now compete for shipping lanes, natural resources, and military presence in the far north. Canada, Russia, the U.S., China, Norway, all maneuver for advantage. What was once considered useless wasteland is now a strategic asset. But beneath that urgency lies danger. The Arctic ecosystem is one of the most fragile on Earth. Every ripple of change, temperature, salinity, ice coverage, can set off cascading effects. Indigenous communities face erosion of land, culture, and food security. Polar bears, seals, caribou, and migratory birds are losing their habitats. And as the ice goes, so too does the barrier that once protected this region from overuse. Franklin's expedition perished because the Arctic was too harsh to conquer. Today, the opposite may be true. It is becoming too vulnerable to survive conquest. There is irony here. We spent centuries trying to force our way into the north. Now that it is opening, we face a moral reckoning. Will we protect what's left, or repeat the mistakes of the past with more advanced tools? The Franklin story warns us what happens when we ignore limits. And the Arctic is still teaching, because what melts away is not just ice, but certainty, control, and the illusion of invincibility. We are entering a world Franklin never imagined, an Arctic without ice, and the true frontier may not be what we find, but what we choose to preserve. The snow still falls on Beechy Island. Winds still whisper across King William Island. The wrecks of Erebus and Terror still rest in the depths, quiet, dark, untouched by time's rush. And the bones, the notes, the graves, they remain. But the Franklin story is no longer buried. It is taught, debated, researched, mourned, because in that silence we heard more than tragedy. We heard ourselves. The men of the expedition are gone, yet their journey lives on, not as a failure, not as a fable, but as a mirror, one that reflects the ambitions and flaws of empire, the cost of certainty, and the strength of those who search, endure, and remember. What remains is not just history, it's warning and wisdom. It's the Inuit voice that told the truth when no one listened. It's the frozen hands of sailors who wrote their names into the margins of survival. It's the caution that discovery is never free, and that every map has a cost. Now, as the Arctic opens and the world changes, we must choose what to carry forward. Will we march onward without learning, or will we stop and listen to the wind, the ice, the silence? Because the Franklin expedition didn't just vanish, it speaks. And if we're quiet enough, if we're still, we can still hear it. Whispers beneath the ice, footsteps in the snow, a story not of conquest, but of consequence.